Welcome to the Oshow. I'm Laura Babcock. And just when City Council did something amazing and pushed back against Ford's attempts to expand our urban boundary, a day that activists and people who were trying to protect the Greenbelt were celebrating, something crazy happened. Something that is so counterintuitive to the stated housing policy of Hamilton Council, something that could lose the city potentially millions in terms of revenues and more access to housing stock. Yeah, and they're claiming it was a mistake, an accident. I'm not too sure about that, but we'll get into it with Councillor John Paul Danko. John Paul, thank you so much for being here today. So what the hell happened?
That's a good question that I think that we're all trying to sort out in the aftermath. So I think this is a little bit inside baseball, but just to start off, I want to assure everyone that might be watching that I don't think that there's any ill intent here. It was just random circumstance that led to an outcome that I don't think anybody was expecting in the moment. I know I've talked to Councillor Jackson. I know Councillor Nan has talked to Councillor Jackson, and he's adamant that it was just circumstance. He wanted to be consistent in his vote on the vacant unit tax, and it just so happened who happened to be in the room at the time that it failed on a tie vote.
Let me just question you on that.
Yep.
Because, and here's where I'm not being conspiratorial, but literally 2 days prior to this surprise accidental never happened before vote, we had the Hamilton Spectator columnist run a column that said that there was this big divide on council and literally named everybody who happened to be there to happen to vote down this important policy that would help with affordable housing. So when you look at the names of the people who voted against it, I mean, they were listed as part of that cadre against the more progressives on council. So John Paul, had they voted against the vacant unit tax in the past? I mean, obviously council passed it. Had they voted against it then?
I believe so. And I think that's what happened, where they were just trying to be consistent in their votes from the past. And it just so happens that was who was there. And that was the vote that took place. Usually bills are a technicality, right? Like the actual debate is on the policy, which was actually approved by council. So the policy is in place, but it leaves us in this really awkward position where we've approved policy, but now we can't actually fully enact the policy because the bill failed on a tie vote. I'm not too worried about it. We'll fix it. It just, some of the procedural technicalities around that are a little bit complex, just how it happened.
Well, Narinder Nan, who had been a big proponent for this, pushing for this, because obviously her ward has deep poverty in it, as do numerous wards in Hamilton. And she really very much wanted to make this common sense bylaw go through. I mean, we've seen Vancouver earn millions of dollars in over 5 years enacting this exact same bylaw. We've seen housing stocks rise, so it's a no-brainer. So I want to get you in a moment to try to understand why that group of councillors, including Tom Jackson, who's been around for, 30 plus years on this council, which is why I don't buy that it was accidental if he's the one who introduced it, because come on, he's been there longer than anyone. He would know the ramifications of what he was doing. But anyway, the fact is they're leaving all that on the table. So I want to try to get a sense from you of why they would oppose it in the very first place. But Narinder was very upset because she had stepped out because she thought that it was just procedural, like, it was just going to pass because it had already been passed by council, left to go help her mother who was in the hospital who's ill. Cameron Kretsch left the meeting as well, thinking it was procedural, had something else to do, but he came out this morning and said, I should have been there. Like, I didn't know. He feels badly about it and is hoping to fix it. Maureen has also come out as a councillor and tried to explain it. You came out last night pretty angry about it. And I haven't, the mayor was tweeting about the Grey Cup revenues. So, I mean, like, Andrea, I know she didn't vote on it because she has a vacant unit and she called the conflict of interest. But, I would expect the mayor, after an embarrassing either technical error, poor governance, or something more, nefarious, would have come out and spoken to the people like you are right now, John Paul, and said, I think we can fix this. Here's what happened. I don't think anything untoward was at play here. So do you expect her to speak to this? And then let's talk about why your councillor colleagues were against this common sense affordable housing measure in the first place.
Well, I'm not sure what the mayor is going to do, or anybody else, and I'm not sure why specifically some of my colleagues are opposed to the vacant unit tax, but I will explain why I am in favor of it, and why, Councillor Nan, going all the way back to last term, has been a steadfast leader on the housing file, and this being a very important component of it that she led on for years. We had to ask the province for permission to actually put in place to initiate a vacant unit tax. We just got that permission this term. And Councillor Nan was the one that initiated all of that from the very beginning. So, I can understand why she is very frustrated, as are many of us. The whole purpose of the vacant unit tax is so that investment property owners that have multiple properties don't leave them empty without tenants for a long period of time. With the housing market right now, you can just sit on a property for, a few years and earn 20, 30, 50% returns on your original investment just because of the increase in value of that property. You don't even need to rent it out. And in cities like Vancouver, Toronto, Montreal, we've seen a lot of foreign investment. 30% of the housing market is investor property owners. So that is happening here in Hamilton.
That's shocking. That number, 30%, is shocking. I knew there were some speculators and, people scooping up deals because they had the cash flow, but I had no idea that it was 30% of our market. I mean, what a disaster.
Yeah. And those are people that, some of them are good property owners, good landlords. They want to earn revenue through rentals. But if you're a foreign property owner or somebody that's just not really that interested in the rental market, you could see how it would be really easy. If you have enough money to buy a house cash, why rent it out to somebody and have all those problems that potentially, if you can just leave it vacant and then sell it the next year for 20% return. So the vacant tax would put just a 1% tax on the value of that home. So if it's a home or a unit that's valued at $1 million, the vacant unit tax would be $10,000 a year.
Which is a lot, is a lot. When I think about the HATS project, right? The tiny shelters, what were they asking from council? 100 grand? So that's 10 of those properties being taxed would have paid for the HATS pilot, which makes me freaking bananas, JP. So, I'll take your comment that Tom says, oops, my bad, didn't know what would happen. Okay, the proof for me will be in the pudding, and I may get an email from Tom later, but the proof will be in the pudding. And that is this. If council figures out how to get back to the table and vote this thing through the way they should have done yesterday, and we can get to taxing those vacant properties, those investment properties, and get some money into our affordable housing solutions, then the people who voted against it will probably stay there. They shouldn't. I hope the community all speaks to them and says, like, come on, like, what is the opposition to this thing? It's ridiculous. Who are you protecting? But I think that the people who are in the middle, who might be kind of like not completely understanding or bought in or fully invested in it, I hope that they don't have the next 2 weeks of getting pushed and lobbied so that they end up coming back and killing this thing for reals. I mean, is that a concern?
I think it is somewhat of a concern. There does need to be a 2/3 majority in order to overturn the original direction. I don't think that's going to happen. But I think the importance of this is not just the vacant unit tax. It's part of a larger multiple housing policies that we as a council have said is a priority, right? We've said housing and homelessness is a crisis and we need to do everything that we can to address these issues. So there's multiple policies. There's the rental licensing that's gone into place in Ward 8 and Ward 1. The vacant unit tax is part of that. Short-term rental licensing is very important. That's licensing Airbnbs. The rent eviction bylaw that's coming to help protect tenants to stay in their units. We're working on family-friendly housing policies that promote not just bachelors and one bedrooms, but actually 2 and 3 bedroom units. And then all of the planning policies that we're putting in place that permit secondary dwelling units as of right, multiple units on a residential lot. So there's so much that's going on in the policy sphere, and they all tie together. And without the vacant unit tax, so if we're putting in licensing, for example, on rental units, well, if people don't want to go through the licensing, they're like, oh, I'm just going to leave it vacant. We also need that tool to go together in the greater suite, for all these things to make sense, for us to really make some progress on housing and affordability.
In fact, we had an Oshow special on it last week, where we talked about things that every single level of government can do to this thing to help fix this crisis, wartime effort type stuff.
Pressures that we are facing right now in housing and homelessness are very similar to, municipalities across Canada, across North America. And it is a crisis level that everyone is struggling to address. Now, we do have the new housing secretariat with, a 4-pillar strategic approach to housing, focusing on new affordable units, focusing on keeping existing rental units in the market, keeping tenants in those units so that we're not losing them, and then also building new supportive units. But all these things go together. And when you look at municipalities, we are facing the brunt of this crisis, and we are being forced to finance the brunt of this crisis as well, because obviously all these solutions cost a great deal of money. We just had a report on what we are actually spending on housing and homelessness. Mm-hmm. And in the 2023 fiscal year, we have invested $146.6 million in total. And of that, here's the real key. Of that, $75.6 million was funded by City of Hamilton taxpayers on the levy, and less than half was actually funded by the province and the federal government. And that's not sustainable for taxpayers to continue year after year after year facing this crisis by having to fund that level of investment. We spent $30 million over the original 2023 budget in year because of the crisis, in order to fund things that we had no choice. We just had to fund.
And people are mad at you as a council because they think they've heard this 14% potential income or, tax increase coming. I don't think you'll settle on that, but they hear that, they get scared, right? They don't know all the things that you just articulated. Honestly, I wish somebody else, I don't know, maybe the mayor was more forthright and more consistent in articulating every single one of those housing policies that you just did, because I think if people heard them itemized and heard it redundantly over and over again, they might actually think that this council is doing some things, right? Let me take issue with you on one thing, and I don't know if you watched the Oshow on the housing crisis, but your name came up.
Yes.
And my issue with you on that, John Paul, was not that you're not working on these things, not that you didn't support this vacant tax. I know that you want to tackle the housing and homelessness crisis. It's maybe the tone of the way that you tweeted out the fact that the issue in Hamilton isn't housing or homelessness, it's the fact that we lack these industrial lands for the industrial tax base. I have heard that argument, and I think it's a correct argument, for 30 years since I came to Hamilton, that it used to be the industrial tax base, commercial industrial paid for everything. Then when the factories left, like many other Rust Belt cities on the Great Lakes, we lost that, and now it went to the heavy burden is on the residential tax base. That is true. I don't think anyone argues with that. But my issue was in tone, because if I'm one of the 1,600 people who are homeless, if I'm one of the people that you and I see all the time in our neighborhood, and we live near each other, near your ward, there are people living on the street. There are people living and could die in the cold. And so to me, I just, talking about that argument, which yes, makes sense economically, takes away the humanity of the fact that if I'm starving, nothing like industrial versus residential tax base is the urgent priority. It's the survival of myself and my family and my pets. So do you want to just respond to that? Because I had my rant. Your turn, sir.
No, and I think that's a very fair criticism. And I think sometimes the tone of what is on social media or even in email is not necessarily convey, the intention. But I definitely understand the criticism that was there on that. But the fact is, when you look at the amount of in-year spending that we are, all of these things fall to municipalities. When the federal government is not stepping up, when the provincial government's not going to step up, we have no choice. We cannot leave people, as you say, freezing in the cold. We have to do as much as we can. So the frustration from, a municipal perspective is that because we've lost that commercial industrial tax base, we don't have the flexibility to be as reactive as we would otherwise be if we had other sources of revenue.
I understand. Yep.
Yeah.
And
So
it's a good
so when you have
argument.
these, yeah,
Serious way, right? I mean, you have to let people know how it works because people
yeah,
complain about more taxes and yet they complain about lack of housing and rental, and homeless people are on the street, or people living in homelessness. And so it must be difficult sitting there when the cities are not even getting development fees anymore, right, from Ford. I mean, Ford is putting the cities in a terrible position. And I want to get to the
absolutely.
Greenbelt and the urban sprawl in just a second, the urban boundary victory at council. So I get that. And I was on CTV the other night railing against Trudeau and their economic update, saying it wasn't enough for what we need in this country for housing, right? And I rail a little bit at the Ford government these days for all kinds of things that I equate to malfeasance, including their approach to housing and removing rent control. So I'm glad to hear that there's a bylaw in place in Hamilton. Before we get off this topic, though, I promised our angry viewers who saw what happened yesterday at council, Tom, Mike Spatafora, Francis, Esther, I think Beatty, and I'm not sure if the other one was Clark.
Yes.
If you voted against the vacant unit tax, you cannot tell me with a straight face that you support this affordable housing strategy of the city. Like, explain thyself, please, because it looks terrible. And it looks like this was an end run around a decision that council already made that you lost. Why did you fight this thing if it's going to bring millions of dollars to the city that, as we just discussed, is crushed and needs money? Like, I want to hear an explanation from them. Okay, so you did have a great moment, and I'm glad, timing wise, to have you here, John Paul, in the few minutes we have left, because you have been a vanguard for the Hamilton fight, taking it directly to Ford on Twitter. You've had some tone there as well about the Greenbelt, right? And so a couple questions for you. There was, from the Greenbelt activists and the urban sprawl activists in Hamilton, of which there are tens of thousands, they are mighty. And we had Mike Green, the head of the Green Party, on saying how, Hamilton really is the tip of the spear on this issue. They had a big success yesterday. They were thrilled about it. And then in the next breath, they posted, just when we were celebrating, this other thing we just discussed happened, this disastrous vote. So can you just explain to me, what was the significance of yesterday's vote at council? And also, have you seen evidence that Ford intends to give back the Greenbelt? Because he's talking about the fact that, 2 months to the day of his weepy announcement about returning all the lands and begging for the trust of the people of Ontario, he's now saying we don't give two hoots about it, which to me is nothing more than cynical, or maybe more than cynical, might be worse. So do you think we're going to get those lands back?
Yes, they've committed to that. We have, I think, no reason to expect that they're not going to follow through. They've already, I think, been dragged through the mud, perhaps as much as it's possible to be dragged through the mud.
Oh, there's always more mud. There's always more drag. Right?
More feet from that centipede.
There's more hoots to give. Yeah. Well, yeah, when Kathleen Wynne, or last time when I said, Kathleen Wynne, when she was on, said another shoe's going to drop. And I was like, this thing's a centipede. There's so many shoes dropping. But you believe that. So, we'll put that for the anxious audience on the Oshow here. You're saying you don't believe that the Greenbelt lands will be reneged on again. You believe that the Premier will come forward with that. That's good to hear. It's good to hear. So go on.
And just to put this in perspective of how big of a really historic victory this is for the residents of Hamilton, it's hard to put enough emphasis on how monumental it is that we're not expanding our urban boundary and we're not growing into the Greenbelt, that we're not going to pave over the best farmland in Canada. I was talking to Councillor Nan and Councillor Wilson, a couple of days ago about this and just how all these circumstances came together. When I originally ran for council way back in 2016, this was one of the issues that was key for me personally, is responsible, environmentally friendly growth, protecting farmland. That was one of my core issues that I thought that I would be able to bring something to the table on. And just all the circumstances that came together, last term of council voting not to expand the urban boundary, that was a massive win just in itself, with Councillor Clark's leadership on the Elfrida component. Some of that was on the basis that, the province is just going to overturn this anyway, so this vote doesn't really matter. But, we still got the vote in place to not expand the urban boundary. And then just the overwhelming support that we had from the residents of Hamilton. Of course, you always have the activist component to that, but just the everyday residents just did not buy into this plan to pave over farmland. And the support that we had from just regular everyday constituents, I think, is what really drove council to support what the popular vision for our city was. And just financially, environmentally, like all of these things come together to really give some amazing optimism for the future of our city.
Well, I have to say, as an activist, the regular, ordinary people, whatever you're calling people who have, full-time jobs, daily lives, lots of responsibilities, and are not consumed with social justice and the news. Without the activists, they might not be aware of what's at risk, right? Absolutely. So I never want anyone on this program to in any way slight activists. We're incredibly important, not me, but the heroes among us are activists often. So I'm really glad to hear that we've stopped that. Let me ask though, for our provincial audience, sort of as a one of my final questions here, JP, how can other municipal councils do what Hamilton did? Because we've seen what looks like mayors in other towns saying, can we actually keep, pull that stuff out of the Greenbelt the way that the premier was planning to, could we maybe, and no public consultation on it? I mean, it kind of feels like maybe the Ford government is exerting some pressure on some municipalities to do an end run on this thing. I could be just suspicious, but I mean, what's your advice to other municipalities? And do you think I'm being suspicious, or do you see that as well?
I think a lot of municipalities have different factors that are involved, and we've seen that across the province. And also some of these lands are not all the same. Like even in Hamilton, the Stony Creek, the 50 road lands are quite a bit different than the lands in Ancaster. So, it's difficult to say where other municipalities are, but I'm incredibly proud of the leadership role that Hamilton played in this entire discussion from start to finish. That we really did lead the province in being responsible in having a really long-term vision for what it is that we want our city to look like in the future, where we're going to go. And our growth plans are core to that. And I think maybe there's some other municipalities that aren't quite that far along or haven't thought that far ahead. But hopefully, seeing what we're doing in Hamilton can inspire other municipalities to really take a little bit more seriously some of those concerns.
Well, I appreciate you coming on the program as always, JP, and the fact that you take the criticism that we put on here, whether councillors are my friends or not. If you're doing something that pisses me off, I will say so, as you know, and maybe take heed of Renee Wetzler's suggestion to you about mixed use, I believe, planning within your ward and supporting that, because I know you look for the highest purpose for developments and things like that, and you seem on track with the housing strategy. So thank you for your time, giving us all this information, and we'll end it on the high note of Hamilton leading the province on protecting the Greenbelt and urban sprawl and farmland after the crazy 24 hours that you've had as a councillor. Let's leave it on a high note, folks. Thank you for watching the Oshow. Please keep subscribing on YouTube and take the advice of Hamilton Council. It's surprising to say that, but I'm pleased I can, about how to handle the province and to stay firm on protecting our precious farmland that we all need so much. Thanks for watching the Oshow. Take care, Jiffy.
Thank you.
When you care about current affairs, it's on the Oshow. And when you want to get clear what's going on here, it's on the Oshow. If you like to stay in the know, tune yourself into the Oshow. It's the Oshow. Laura Babcock's the Oshow. With a lot of great guests, she puts them to the test on the Oshow. There's no doubt they'll be calling them out on the Oshow. Stand for something or fall for it all. Ontario, hear the call on the Oshow. It's a podcast, the Oshow. Laura Babcock's the Oshow. Stay informed with the Oshow.